And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. It's my honor today to have my legal mentors, Brian Schuette and Larry Crain, on the line to talk about the Shutdown, Showdown, California style. It kind of raises an image of maybe JMac, John MacArthur, in one corner and Gavin Newsom on the other corner, but maybe it's not exactly like that. But that's kind of the idea. And this is an ongoing issue. I thought perhaps back in March that this would go for a couple months, but this is still ongoing as of middle of September. And so I want to get both Brian and Larry's opinions on this. So, Larry, how are you today?
Very good, Josh. Good to be with you this morning, and exciting topic. I'm sure that will resonate with a lot of the viewers that you have today.
And Brian, it's also good to see you as well. Brian, how are you this morning?
Doing well. Yeah, thanks for inviting me onto the podcast.
And just as we get started, Brian has introduced a new style of clothing. He doesn't have to show it to us this morning, but he calls it coronavirus casual. And us attorneys normally have to wear a suit and tie, but I believe it involves something like a suit, a shirt, shorts, and I think you were wearing. Maybe they weren't Crocs, but they certainly weren't formal wear. So could you describe a little bit of coronavirus casual for us?
No, I don't think I'd care to do that. What you see is what you get.
Okay. But if you're just listening, by the way, Brian he's very nice and dapper this morning, so you can't tell. But for those that are new to the podcast, especially over the last 6 months or so, I just wanted to mention to you that I'm so thankful for these two men. I consider them my legal mentors, but also friends. As a young attorney, they kind of took me under their wing. Showed me the practice of law, but most importantly, how to do that while also being a Christian and having strong beliefs, but serving people across all sorts of different spectrums of American life, but doing so as a follower of Jesus. So I'm definitely grateful for that. A couple highlights. So with Larry, we assisted a pharmacist who was being forced to sell abortifacient drugs, and then also helped a couple homeschoolers that were being kept out of a national chess tournament because of their beliefs being homeschoolers. And Brian and I traveled kind of the country in a sense, helping churches redo documents and deal with some internal issues. And Brian, perhaps my favorite memory, it's a painful one, but was going into a church, asking them how they operated and having our very salvation question. I think go ahead, Brian.
Oh, yes, I do remember that now. Okay, yes.
Yeah, we affectionately called that one the ambush, I believe. So,
yeah, that one was. I didn't feel a strong ministry connection with that particular pastor.
Yeah, who knew? Well, the question of the day, of course, is about the Shutdown, Showdown in California. If you've been following the podcast, following the blogs, we've talked a good bit about this, talking about it from kind of the ethical perspective, but then also the legal perspective. And so just a quick review, and I'm going to jump right in to asking Larry and Brian's perspective on this. But quick review, not a lot has changed since our blog post in late August, but you essentially have three primary churches, kind of a fourth one as well. But so you have, first of all, Grace Community Church, John MacArthur. They have said, hey, we're going to meet. We believe that this is a calling from God. We're going to meet regardless of what the government says. Just yesterday, a local California Judge Beckloff, issued an injunction, an order saying that Grace Community Church may not meet indoors. They could meet outdoors, but not indoors. Thomas More Society, representing the church, has said they will appeal it. There's also Godspeak Calvary Chapel, which has said, hey, we're going to meet despite orders. Pastor McCoy has been held in contempt, and the church has been fined. My understanding, they're still meeting. North Valley Baptist Church, Pastor Jack Treber, they're also meeting, and the fines have really racked up for the church. It's somewhere up in the $50,000 to maybe $100,000 range for them. And then there's one other church that hasn't received as much press, but that's Harvest Rock Church. They filed a suit in federal court. The federal court just a couple of days ago refused to grant them emergency relief. So that's kind of the latest that I've been able to find online. So, Larry, I wanted to pass the ball to you. You have extensive experience in federal court. You've litigated up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So just want to get your take kind of on the the legal situation. Do you foresee California officials turning to like police enforcing these orders? Do you think they'll let the fines stack up? So I'll just kind of generally pass the ball to you and get your thoughts on what's going on there in California.
Sure, Josh. It's been my experience that the contempt powers of a court are among the most powerful exercises of power known in the government. In fact, a judge faced with enforcing his orders has virtually unlimited discretion. He can impose fines, he can imprison, he can levy sanctions that would, in the ordinary case, disincentivize anyone to violate his or her order. The problem we've got is this. The situation in California is now spreading to other states. And in times of national disaster or catastrophe like we have here, federal courts and even state courts will not second guess a governor in the exercise, or mayor in the exercise of their executive power when they're acting pursuant to a delegation of authority by their legislature, because they're acting at the pinnacle of their power at that point. And we've seen it time and time again. The U.S. Supreme Court has turned down 2 opportunities, as we know, this year to review the power of state governors to impose these type of orders, shutdown orders. And the problem we're running into is that when you run to state court to restrict these governors and you assert any federal constitutional right, then your case can be instantly removed to federal court. And in federal court, as we've seen, the courts are just unwilling to exercise any emergency review over a governor's exercise of power in this case, to the extent that our Supreme Court, I think, I think Gorsuch may have said it best in this Sisolak case, the Calvary Chapel case out of Nevada, where the state of Nevada allowed no more than 50 attendants to attend church. And yet that same numerical limitation didn't apply to the bars and casinos. And Gorsuch, writing in his dissent, said this, and I thought it was very prophetic. He said, the world we inhabit today with a pandemic upon us poses very unusual challenges, but there is no world in which the Constitution permits Nevada to favor Caesar's palace over Calvary's chapel. And yet that's what we're seeing today, time and time again. And a discriminatory or arbitrary enforcement that I would say does target churches to the extent that they impose what I call a viewpoint discrimination on the ability of those who gather to engage in worship, be they singing or praising or whatever it is. So I think we're there. And we're in a time of parenthesis right now because courts are just not going to second guess executives when they're in the midst of national emergencies.
That's helpful. And certainly that Nevada example is, I think, the clearest one. And Alliance Defending Freedom has that case. My understanding is they're going to continue to appeal that Ninth Circuit, maybe back to the U.S. Supreme Court if the court will take it. Quick question about the Grace Community Church case is in state court. I just read Judge Beckloff's decision, and he analyzed their case at the federal level, but then at the state court level. It basically says that the California's Constitution will be interpreted according to state law, but then also it kind of reflects the federal Constitution as well. So has that been your experience, that a state Supreme Court or state court that's looking at a federal constitutional claim is going to say, well, our state Constitution has to be interpreted in a parallel way or in a way that's consistent with the federal Constitution?
Well, in Tennessee, we have what's called a Declaration of Rights. In other words, our state constitution assumes that the rights that are inherent in the inalienable rights that are stated in the U.S. Constitution don't need to be enshrined in a constitution. They're inherent in the rights of man. And therefore, what they call them is a declaration of those rights. Some states put more emphasis on the exercise of individual liberties than even our federal Constitution. And so I think if we've got a shot here, it is to go into state court and argue exclusively state constitutional grounds to try and steer clear of the federal review right now, because we're getting nowhere when your U.S. Supreme Court twice fails to intervene. If you can craft your argument in such a way that it relies on an enhanced state constitutional claim, for example, that the separation of powers in your state between the executive and legislative branches vest in your legislature the right to oversee and rein in a governor who has exceeded his authority or delegation, or is acting in a capricious or arbitrary manner. I think your avenue there is to say that, you know, the governor has exceeded his state constitutional authority. But these are times to be creative for constitutional lawyers. And there's some very good firms out there. Thomas More Society I've litigated with, of course, ADF I have, and they have some very good lawyers involved in these cases, thankfully. But they're time and again running into what seems to be a brick wall.
And that's certainly distressing. Just as I've spoken to pastors, I think we have come to rely on being able to run to court and have the U.S. judiciary kind of solve some of these issues. And that's kind of the distressing fact in this, in the Showdown, is that the courts have not backed up these claims. And so it's kind of like, well, what do we do next? So kind of last question in this particular segment, we were talking before we jumped on that this is a way that, you know, if the state just keeps finding churches, that basically just transfers offerings to the state. So it's kind of this like pay to pray type situation. That's certainly not healthy. So do you comment on that?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it is distressing. I mean, let's face it. This is not the first time we as a nation have had shutdown orders, even involving churches. I remember reading an account back in 1918 during the Spanish flu that the health commissioner for the city of St. Louis shut down the entire city, including places of worship, and imposed fines on those churches that violated it. And so, and it's not fair to compare this to the Black Plague, but certainly during the 14th century, there were widespread closures of church and masses across Europe because of the plague. But the principle here is, how do churches continue to fulfill what they believe are scriptural mandates, as in Hebrews, to forsake not the gathering of yourselves together, and yet honor Caesar, which is also an obligation in Romans. And I think there are ways that it can be done. We're seeing it already in some great churches across our country. But you know, no one wins when you flaunt a judge's order, in my view. If you just flaunt it for the sake of flaunting it. Civil disobedience has its time and place. But as long as churches are allowed creatively to meet and observe some of the safety precautions that are just common sense, then I think we can get through this pandemic until we can hopefully get to a workable vaccine and get back to normal life.
I appreciate that, Larry. So, Brian, that leads us right into a question for you. And I have to tell listeners, Brian has, I think, a unique ability in working with church leaders, just kind of understanding the dynamics of that, solving really difficult, complex church interministry disputes. You know, of course, churches never have any of those. And so, Brian, I wanted to ask you a little bit about this civil disobedience question. And as I've outlined before, first of all, I defer to the conscience of a pastor in his local context, leading a church. If God has called him, you know, pastor feels led to do something, then I'm not going to sit here on a podcast and tell you shouldn't. On the other hand, I think we should focus on wisdom and say, what is wise? considering all these things. And so when it comes to kind of church leadership issues and such, I certainly look to you, Brian, for advice and practical wisdom. What is your take on kind of what's happening in California generally, specifically on this question of civil disobedience?
So generally in California, I think what we're seeing is a culture that has progressed farther than our national culture has in terms of the distance between the church and the state, so to speak. And the contrast there is even greater than it is in our country as a whole. And that really wasn't true even within my lifetime. 30, 40 years ago, there wasn't near the hostility toward the church that appears to have developed there. So I think that's the first thing we're seeing. And I don't think that started at the leadership level of the church and the state. I think it started among the people, and ultimately the government is a downstream reflection of the people. And so I think as a whole, Californians seem to place less value on our religious traditions as a country. I think we're seeing that in some of these judicial decisions. Now, in terms of how all of this is affecting pastors, for those who have the strong convictions, we're kind of getting to see how that's playing out. My real interest isn't so much in the internationally famous, best-selling author, president of a seminary with unlimited resources person. He's going to be able to surround himself, with all of the legal support, and he also has a megaphone that most pastors don't. The ones that I feel the greatest compassion for are those who are just kind of laboring in small and medium sized churches. Like, what is the pastor of a church of 80 people, in a rural part of the state, who has a mostly older congregation? How does he deal with all of these conflicting, obligations? And so, when I've been advising pastors in that position, my starting point is just a reminder that it's okay to be pragmatic. In fact, I think it's very good to be pragmatic. It's wise to be pragmatic. And what does that look like? Well, as a practical matter, the pastor has to weigh between these competing ideas. First, he has the obligation to protect his sheep, and that may mean either not meeting for a time, meeting in a remote way. Facebook Live seems to be a fairly popular approach for pastors with less tech resources. Or it may mean meeting in a modified way in person, but then it also means seeing to the spiritual well-being of your congregation. And one thing is certain, meeting on Facebook is not going to produce the same result as meeting in person. And so there's the tension. They have to choose between protecting the physical health and promoting the spiritual health. And no matter what they do, they're going to be open to harsh criticism from someone who's in the opposite camp.
And that's something I certainly want to underline. And as I've talked with pastors, as I've been here in my church trying to I've helped navigate that a bit. But at the end of the day, that's the senior pastor's call. And you see people literally dropping off of their spiritual habits. At first, a lot of people were online, but now it's like, oh, I can watch it whenever, or maybe I don't watch it. And coming to church is a bit of a habit. And if you get out of it, there's I think a lot of concern among church leaders. What does that do to your spiritual walk? And so, yeah, these are tough things to navigate. Any other thoughts on the civil disobedience question?
Yeah, I do have a thought. Larry started to touch on it. I haven't really been all that publicly vocal about the pandemic and how churches should approach it. And the reason I haven't is it's been such a moving, picture. It's never really settled down very much, just because whenever there's an environment of uncertainty, it's going to be difficult to get clear legal decisions. And in fact, I think some of the legal decisions that we're disappointed in as constitutional conservative believers, those are really a reflection of the kind of the tumult and the ever changing backdrop against which those decisions would have to be made. And I do think judges and courts as a whole are very reluctant to speak definitively into an undefined situation. So I'm not sure that I would automatically label it as anti-Christian bias, or it's postmodernism in its most virulent form. I think some of it is just a very practical resistance to being too definitive in an environment that's not.
That's helpful. And so back to you, Larry, and that's right along these lines. And so you have, of course, the Nevada decision and the California decision, both by the Supreme Court on emergency requests for relief, which have a very, very high standard of proof. And I think as to what Brian was speaking to, uh, judges don't want to be the one. It's like, here's the hot potato. You make the really hard decision in the midst of all of these swirling opinions. And I think judges want to be the ones to second guess local governors at this point. But do you see maybe down the road, say the Nevada case works itself back up to the Supreme Court? Do you see perhaps the Supreme Court making a different decision in the future? And of course, you don't have a crystal ball, but I would just be interested in your opinion on that.
Well, if you look at history, experience teaches us that courts make far better decisions in the calm, clear light of day than they do based on exigent circumstances and emergent situations, because they're able to carefully deliberate, and their decisions, they know, will not have immediate impact on lives and safety of others like they do today. I mean, they're drawing lines in the sand that are carefully, I think, weighted in favor of state regulation right now, because they gamble, as Brian said, with uncertainty if they risk going too far and overturning these decisions. And there's a spike in COVID cases that they feel responsible for. But, the Supreme Court has never fully addressed the balancing of the state's compelling interests during times of outbreak, except once that I can see. In 1905, there was a case called Jacobson versus Commonwealth of Massachusetts involving a smallpox outbreak in which Cambridge, Massachusetts was laid low because of smallpox. And the mayor there said everyone's going to get inoculated, vaccinated. And Jacobson said, no, not me, and challenged it. And of course, he lost, because in that instance, the court said that we're going to weigh the risk of doubt in favor of the state having a compelling interest in promoting the health and safety of its citizens. I can foresee this scenario happening once our pharmaceutical companies produce an acceptable vaccine. There may be still others who will refuse to take the vaccination. In fact, I think Brian and I have been contacted by one such individual who's an organization that is saying a number of its people will not be taking the vaccine once it's approved. So that may yet rear its head again in the context of COVID. But, the Supreme Court needs to review this case. And I predict, the four justices who are in favor of it, Kavanaugh, Thomas, Gorsuch, and Alito, just need to get one more vote on their side. And I think they will hopefully have an opportunity. I'm sorry, I may have lost video there.
No,
for a
there
second.
We go. Yeah, and you're back. And that's helpful. And one of the things I noticed about Jacobson is I don't think that claim was a religious exercise claim. That was just basically, I don't want to take the virus. And so I think the Christians can say, hey, maybe nobody gets a sticker right now for opening things back up and then things spiking. So maybe with some time and some of the crisis passing, a clear-headed decision may say, here's a better way to look through these things. So as we kind of wrap up today, Larry, I wanted to come back to you and ask, for pastors that are concerned about this and say, okay, if the federal judiciary is not going to second guess my governor, is there anything else that can be done to just say, here are the rules? Here's some guidelines or even a restriction. And I believe that you testified in front of the Tennessee legislature here recently. But do you have any thoughts on ways that Christians could say, we're not targeting anybody, but we do think there needs to be tighter rules as far as how these shutdowns should happen?
Yeah, there are three things I'm telling churches they need to do. First of all, it's imperative, in my view, that regardless of the size of the church, whether it's a poor church in an urban area or a rural church with a few members or a large megachurch, the first thing they need to do is seek competent legal advice. These executive orders are crafted in such a way that they contain within them a lot of exemptions already, and how they apply to the church is a question that some attorney who specializes in church law needs to be looking at on behalf of these churches. They vary from state to state and indeed from community to community within states. Secondly, I think churches need to devise ways to comply with executive orders when it comes to corporate worship, when they can do so in a manner that doesn't violate the strict wording of the executive order. And if churches can get creative, live streaming may not work for a lot of small churches, like Brian said, but you can have outdoor church gatherings with suitable distancing and improvisation. I think that this is a time for the church to say, let's show the world that we can be both compliant and yet continue to exercise our traditions in a way that honor God and do so in a way that doesn't expose someone to risk. Finally, thirdly, I think churches need to approach their state legislative branch because ultimate authority in virtually all 50 states is vested with the legislature to amend or modify the grant of executive power here, and to impose some safeguards, some meaningful common sense ways to appeal or through a joint resolution of the legislature when those orders, or a judge goes renegade, or a governor goes renegade and starts imposing broad orders like we're seeing in California. So those are three tips that I would give a church right now. I think the end is in sight. I really believe the end is in sight here, but we can learn a great deal through this, because one thing we know for sure, there will be more catastrophes down the road. Things will happen in the future, and maybe we can, from what we learn through this pandemic, better protect churches and our children and grandchildren in the future.
That's really helpful. And so for pastors that are just thinking, oh no, I can't, I just can't believe this is going on, I think that's a healthy way to channel that energy. And that doesn't have to be, screaming at your governor. It can be, hey, and I think business owners are going to want some of the same. How there was a lot of ambiguity with some of these things, what gets labeled essential, what doesn't. And so I think there's a lot of angst over that. And that's a healthy place to channel it and say, let's get with the legislature. Let's think through what's a better way to do this in the future. And so, Brian, let me pass the ball to you. You do a lot of work with helping churches kind of work through their leadership structures and trying to make some of these difficult decisions. And if there was ever a time for church conflict, there was always conflict. It has been rough for pastors as I've been speaking to them. So any thoughts for what churches could do, both kind of inside the church and then also, trying to bridge the gap in between the church and local officials?
As you'll recall over the years, we've always emphasized that your starting point as a church leader is what the Bible says. How does the Bible speak to this particular issue? And we're going to wrap our church approach around that. And so on the issue of how to respond to civil authority, especially in those circumstances where you don't fully agree with it, I think we have to go. We need to go to the Bible, and Jesus spoke very clearly to the issue of how we respond to human authority in Matthew chapter 22. The well-known passage that we're to render to Caesar what is Caesar and to God. And I think that speaks to a balance here that even though we are citizens of heaven, we are sojourners on this earth, and until our time here comes to an end. And when you're an occupant of a country that's not your own, you are still subject to its laws. So I think that's the principle in Matthew 22. We also see Paul making a very robust statement about in Romans chapter 13 about the need to submit to authority, and talking about the failure to submit to authority. Is a cause for great criticism for the believer. And I think about some of the pastors who've tried to spark conflict by what I would regard, and I think most people, as unnecessary defiance of the civil authority, and to unfairly characterize their motives, as being to harm believers and whatnot. And so I think that's kind of a boundary on one side of this. Peter also talks about it in 1 Peter chapter 3. And a very interesting thing that we've got an inheritance in another place that's imperishable. So let's keep this one in its proper perspective. And then lastly, the tension that we live in is between Romans 13 and Acts chapter 4, where Peter tells the Sanhedrin, whether we should obey you or God, you can decide. But as for us, we can't stop talking about what we've seen and heard. So those are sort of the broad principles that a church would need to start with, and then ask this question: have we reached the point where disobedience is necessary? Now, obviously, John MacArthur and his church have answered that question in the affirmative, and I respect that decision. But the practical fact of the matter is, most churches aren't going to be faced with anything quite that dramatic. Follow the reasonable measures to protect the health of people while continuing to live out your mandate to pastor the church or lead the church, and to be a participant in the church.
That's helpful. And just one thing that I've encouraged churches to think about is, if there was ever a time to build relationships with elected officials, to kind of reemphasize that. It seems that in states, and you mentioned that California, it's further down the road in this process of secularization, but in a lot of states, there's still a great opportunity to build that relationship in between the church, local officials, so that when something like this comes up, there's trust, there's relationship built, and where that has happened, these conflicts have not been as sharp. Now, that's not a solve all, but it is certainly a practical step. And one of the emphasis on this podcast is, okay, here's what's happened. We can wring our hands about it, but what can we do about it? And so what we've talked about, going to your state legislature, teaching on these issues biblically, looking at building relationships with elected officials, I think are good ways to channel that energy. So Larry, I wanted to start with you. For listeners that'd be interested in your services, I believe you're licensed in Tennessee as well as Virginia, but you help churches all across the country. How can listeners find you?
Well, they can go to crainlaw.legal, www.crainlaw.legal. I'm happy to respond to any church or pastors or ministers who are leaders who have questions or wrestling with this. And I'm sure that there are a great number, but we try to keep a resource available and try and keep abreast of what's changing, as I know you have, Josh, done an excellent job also. So we view that aspect of our practice here as a ministry, and I'm happy to help churches any way that we can. It's been a big part of my practice over the last 30-something years, so glad to do it.
Appreciate that, Larry. And so, Brian, you also have a practice that assists churches, but then you have what's called the Healthy Church Initiative, where you focus on kind of rethinking some of the leadership structures of churches, working through organizational documents, and then also doing some conflict resolution when it's just when it gets tough and nasty. It's been just amazing to see you go in and solve some of these things in a way that honors and glorifies God. So if you'd let listeners know about your firm, but also a little bit about Healthy Church.
Oh, thank you, Josh. Yeah, I do step into those situations sometimes, and sometimes we reach what we regard as a successful resolution, and sometimes we leave with the problem not completely solved. But it's always important, I think, to engage, and even if you don't achieve your goal, I think if you approach it with the right spirit, you're still bringing some benefit to it. And we have focused, in addition to the dispute resolution, and as you guys both know, one of my great passions in this particular area is to help churches with governance, because I sincerely believe that a lot of the struggles that pastors face and a lot of this dysfunction that we see in churches is a consequence of not being structured in leadership in an ideal way that's a good reflection of the biblical principles for church governance. And to find out more about the things that I do, you can go to my website, which is www.slg, which stands for Schuette Law Group .legal, slg.legal.
All right, so we'll link to those in the show notes as well. But just want to thank both of you for your investment in me. I will be grateful for that for the rest of my life, and taking kind of a young upstart attorney, pretty idealistic, and kind of showing me the ropes. And so I also want to thank you also for your thoughts on this. This is certainly developing. I know a lot of pastors are trying to wrestle through this thing and are concerned on the direction that it's going. I know it's going to be helpful to many. So any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Good job, Josh. Keep up the good work.
Brian, anything?
Ditto.
All right. Well, thank you again for being on. And this will be up here soon. And we'll continue to track these developments, the Shutdown, Showdown, California style.